Peter B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Friday, September 27th, 2019. In a risky move, the New York Times has given certain clues about the identity of the whistleblower in the new Ukraine scandal. This is another act of yellow journalism, and I believe it's indefensible. Now, what the Times has revealed is limited details about, we know it is a man. That man works at the Central Intelligence Agency, and that man, whose name and further details we don't have, reportedly did a tour of duty at the White House. Now, that makes it possible for powers of deduction to be applied that don't require Sherlock Holmes-level skill. And Trump could easily figure out the identity of this whistleblower before he is prepared to be exposed. And it's not lost on many of us that yesterday, in one of those, dippy comments that Trump made that's not a complete thought, he was leaving the United Nations talking to a group of American workers, and he said, he kind of longed for the old days. He claimed that those who were feeding information to the whistleblower were like spies. And then he waxed about how in the good old days we had different ways of dealing with spies. Now, he didn't complete the thought, like so many danglers that this guy produces. But the inference is pretty clear. We used to execute people who were considered spies. So the attorney for the unnamed whistleblower, Andrew Bakaj, any decision to report any perceived identifying information of the whistleblower is deeply concerning and reckless, as it can place the individual in harm's way. The whistleblower has a right to anonymity, and that's one of the few rights under the federal whistleblower statute, because it carves out huge exemptions for national security employees, likely including this guy at the CIA. So protecting his identity until he is willing to be exposed, I believe, is the duty of any responsible news outlet. And here comes Dean Baquet, executive editor of the New York Times, who has burned whistleblowers more than once, and we will detail in a second. He defended his decision. The role of the whistleblower, including his credibility and his place in the government, is essential to understanding one of the most important issues facing the country: whether the President of the United States abused power and whether the White House covered it up. But the impact on the whistleblower? Well, if Dean Baquet has concerns about it, he didn't say so in the quote that he wrote for his own damn newspaper. So we turn to Kevin Gosztola, a great young reporter whose journalism advocates for the rights of whistleblowers, from Chelsea Manning to Ed Snowden and Julian Assange, and now to this individual. And in his latest post at Shadowproof, Gosztola lowers the boom. He says a very, very small universe of people who are CIA officers and worked in the White House during the Trump administration. Well, he says essentially the New York Times tipped off the administration to who filed the complaint. And he quotes Mr. Baquet, as I just did a moment ago. But my first experience with a whistleblower getting burned by Dean Baquet goes back to 2004-2005. Here in San Francisco, an AT&T employee named Mark Klein blew the whistle on the installation of the equipment to provide blanket or dragnet surveillance of American communications in the United States. And Mark Klein took his story to the Los Angeles Times, where Dean Baquet was the executive editor. And instead of respecting Klein, Dean Baquet handed off all of his information to Senator Dianne Feinstein, who wanted desperately to prosecute Mark Klein, but they couldn't because he hadn't broken any laws, he didn't have a security clearance. But Dean Baquet was central to the undermining and exposure of that whistleblower. And that's not all. John Kiriakou, who I've come to know a little bit after his whistleblowing, and it was the New York Times and reporter Scott Shane, who I know a little bit. I've interviewed him a couple of times. And by the way, Scott Shane's byline has disappeared from the New York Times in recent months. I don't think he left the paper, but he doesn't seem to be on the A-team reporting these days. Anyway, it was John Kiriakou who was interviewed by Scott Shane, and Shane agreed to withhold the publication of Kiriakou's identification of a CIA officer until after Kiriakou had completed his plea deal and been sentenced. But Dean Baquet felt competitive pressure because New Yorker, the magazine, was about to publish a story that covered some of the same ground. And this led Judge Liani Brinkema to express her fury. John Kiriakou did not speak at sentencing, and she snarkily said, "Perhaps you've already said too much." And Kiriakou told Gostola, "I've had a very difficult relationship with the New York Times. In my own personal experience, they don't care one whit about the whistleblower or the source of a story or anybody else. All they care about is scooping the Washington Post and the news networks, and that's it." He says, "I don't think they should have described this whistleblower like they did." He didn't go to the media like I did, says Kiriakou, or like Ellsberg or Snowden. And so we now have a partly exposed whistleblower. And as we learn a little bit about this person, I would say it's too bad that he works at the CIA, because this will fuel Trump's paranoia about the deep state, and also critics like me, who believe that the CIA intervened, that John Brennan and his buddy James Clapper, who was director of national intelligence at the time, that they are the fomenters of the Russiagate narrative. And Trump is not the only one who is skeptical of the intelligence community as a result. The other issues are that his reports are all secondhand, as he acknowledges in his whistleblower complaint letter. And according to Atkinson, the Inspector General of the intelligence group, he identifies as a political partisan and is not a Trump supporter. All this will be grist for tweets that you'll be seeing or trying to ignore for some time into the future. The Washington Post is exclaiming on the work of this whistleblower, who has, quote, by some measures managed to exceed what former counsel Bob Mueller accomplished in 2 years of investigating Trump, producing a file so concerning and factually sound that it has almost single-handedly set in motion the gears of impeachment. And they spin this up. I just mentioned that the whistleblower's claims are all secondhand. The detailed notes of the phone call released this week show that the whistleblower's depictions, having neither heard the conversation nor seen the transcript, were eerily accurate. Well, that's probably feeding Trump's paranoia about the spies. Who told him that stuff if he didn't hear the recording or read the summary of it? So, it is premature. I believe that ultimately this whistleblower will be identified and will get a big fat book deal. Probably be drummed out of the CIA, or maybe assigned to, a post that nobody wants. And once again, U.S. officials and the attorney for the whistleblower have asked news organizations to refrain from releasing details about him. But I'm holding a 10-page story from the Washington Post that is full of speculation about him. And then we have to ask ourselves, is this an appropriate use of the whistleblower law and whistleblower channels? And is this guy actually a whistleblower? And we have to turn to an expert from offshore, Australia's Caitlin Johnstone, who writes today that she's full of snark herself. She cites a CNN headline, "Whistleblower's Complaint is a Devastating Report from a Savvy Official." Johnstone asks, so who is this savvy official, this courageous whistleblower who boldly shone the light of truth upon the mechanisms of power in the interests of the common man? Who is this brave, selfless individual who set off an impeachment inquiry by taking a stand and revealing the fact that the U.S. president made a phone call in July urging the president of Ukraine to help investigate corruption allegations against Joe Biden and his son? Well, she says, this is an officer for the Central Intelligence Agency. A mysterious stranger from the lying, torturing, propagandizing, drug trafficking, assassinating, coup-staging, warmongering, psychopathic CIA was working in the White House, heroically provided the political media class with politically powerful information out of the goodness of his heart, and then vanished off into the Langley sunset. Clearly there is nothing suspicious about this story at all. And then she gets serious. She says even to call this spook a whistleblower is ridiculous. You don't get to call someone from the intelligence community a whistleblower unless they're actually whistleblowing on the U.S. intelligence community. A CIA officer who exposes information about government officials is an operative performing an operation unless proven otherwise, because that's what the CIA does. It liberally leaks information wherever it's convenient for CIA agendas while withholding all other info behind a veil of government secrecy. A CIA officer, I'm quoting still, who exposes information about CIA wrongdoings without the CIA's permission is a whistleblower. A CIA officer who exposes information about someone else is just a spook doing spook things. I love the way she uses her words. And then she responds to a tweet from some guy named Adam Parkamenko. Breaking news, as of 8:30 p.m., the whistleblower fund shared by their attorneys has surpassed $100,000 in less than 24 hours. Johnstone responds, socialism for the rich, capitalism for the poor, privacy for the powerful, surveillance for the powerless, charity for CIA spooks who will receive full establishment protection, rugged individualism for everyone else. And then she notes, while all this political media class cheerleading for whistleblower protections is going on, the most prominent whistleblower in America remains imprisoned for taking a principled stand against secret grand juries while being driven into crippling debt. And that is, of course, Chelsea Manning. I want to thank Dick Atlee for an interesting email. The subject line reads, "They got Capone on tax evasion charges." He says, "I can't help thinking of the conviction of that prominent mob murderer for which the feds never could get enough evidence, but instead used the IRS. We have an equally prominent crook in the White House violating all kinds of corruption laws. Democrats just can't seem to get up the will to point to these and start a real impeachment investigation. But then suddenly there's an accusation of an attempt on this crook's part, actually no concrete evidence, to blackmail Ukraine into investigating the identical but wildly successful blackmail carried out by Joe Biden, to which he admitted/bragged in threatening Ukraine with the loss of $1 billion if Ukraine didn't fire the investigator looking into Biden's son. Oh my goodness. The D Party suddenly has its favorite son under serious fire, and now since their attempts to show Trump-Russian collusion failed, it's impeachment time. Over this. Forget the gross corruption illegality that's been going on over 3 years. That was never grounds for risking political blowback by looking into impeachment. And then he recommends today's column by my friend Joe Lauria at Consortium News. And I'm happy to oblige, Dick, because Joe offers important background information and what is being criminally omitted by the corporate media. And that is that Biden should indeed be investigated in both Ukraine and the United States, starting with the 2014 coup, which he managed. He used the term midwifing, as he colluded with Victoria Nuland, married to a Kagan, and they colluded to overthrow the corrupt but legitimate Yanukovych government, which Lauria correctly notes was the illegal overthrow of a sovereign government. As booty from the coup, the sitting vice president's son, Hunter, soon got a seat on the board of Ukraine's biggest gas producer, Burisma Holdings. This can only be seen as a transparently neo-colonial maneuver to take over a country and install one's own people. But Biden's son wasn't the only one. A family friend of Secretary of State John Kerry also joined Burisma's board. Monsanto got a Ukrainian contract soon after the overthrow. The first post-coup Ukrainian finance minister was an American citizen, a former State Department official who was given Ukrainian citizenship the day before she took up the job. And after a Ukrainian prosecutor began looking into possible corruption at Burisma, Joe Biden openly admitted that as vice president he withheld a $1 billion credit line. And this leads to another major part of the story that's not being told, the routine way the U.S. government conducts foreign policy with bribes, threats, and blackmail. And he offers examples. Nancy Pelosi says that she wants this impeachment to be quick and that this is a subject that is so easy, quote, "We are at a different level of lawlessness that is clear to the American people." Well, I question why, after dragging her Manolo Blahnik-clad feet for 2.5 years, that Pelosi now wants this to happen in a hurry. And today I'm releasing a fresh, in-depth interview podcast with John Bonifaz. He's been on the show before. He is the co-author of The Constitution Demands It, the case for the impeachment of Donald Trump. And he, too, wants to see this all wrapped up by the end of this year, with articles of impeachment released by the end of October. And I'm puzzled by this. So here you'll hear Bonifaz argue the case for a quick impeachment, but he doesn't support the idea that Pelosi promotes of limiting it to Ukraine. He wants a wider scope.
Well, I think there's a lot of pressure, certainly, on Congress from people all over the country who've been calling for these impeachment proceedings to treat it with the urgency that it requires. We actually, on September 12th, before this scandal came to light, we issued a letter to the House Judiciary Committee, statement to the House Judiciary Committee, which was joined by Credo Action, by the people and others, allies in the field, stating that the House Judiciary Committee needed to complete its impeachment inquiry by November 1, vote out articles of impeachment by that date, and by November 15th, take it to the floor of the House of Representatives. And the reason why we set forward that timetable, again, prior to this Ukraine scandal emerging, is because we did not want to see Congress try to run out the clock on impeachment or drag its feet. And further, we're going into an election cycle. We're already in it, obviously, but the Iowa caucuses will begin in early February. And once that process really begins, there will be many who start to say, well, let's just impeach him at the ballot. And we know there is no such thing as impeachment at the ballot. Impeachment is a remedy designed to address a constitutional crisis like the one we face today. And this president, in the Oval Office, remaining unchecked, is a threat to our republic, and that's why we have to proceed expeditiously. But I will also say on the scope question that if we do not expand the scope, we will be setting a very dangerous precedent for future administrations that all the other impeachable conduct this president has committed is okay, but this particular conduct, which certainly is a gross abuse of power as well, is not. And that's a very dangerous precedent.
That's John Bonifaz. Our interview about impeachment is fresh and, I think, fascinating. I don't completely agree with Bonifaz on a couple of points, including that Joe Biden has essentially been exonerated for any possible wrongdoing in Ukraine. But I think it's a worthy conversation, and I hope you will check it out when time permits. Like other podcasts, it's made possible by listeners like you who support my work with your subscriptions, including John Morgan, Jerry and Cheeky Frasia in good old Italy. I don't know who 7-Eleven Condo is, but you just renewed your annual subscription, and I'm grateful for that. Mitchell Kadish has re-upped his annual, and they set an example for the rest of you. Visit peterbcollins.com, find the menu tab, click on Become a Subscriber. You'll hit the sign-up page, and you can choose the level of support that works for you. I've got bonus books for people who take out a new annual $50 subscription and give me a mailing address in the continental U.S. And should you be allergic to PayPal, you can communicate and transact with me via the U.S. mail. Box 150, 660, San Rafael, California, 94915. So these questions about Joe Biden, I think, are significant. And as I have shared with you, to my chagrin, the corporate media just blows them away and says, look, this has all been investigated. Biden didn't do anything wrong. Hunter didn't do anything wrong. Move on. This is all about Trump. And when Trump points the finger at Biden, he's just trying to distract you. And so today, the helpful folks in the fact-check section at the Washington Post offer a quick guide to Trump's false claims about Ukraine and the Bidens. And as I look at this, what I see is they approach Joe Biden's activities and behavior and present them in the most favorable possible light. And they look at Trump, who is a dirty, creepy con man, and they always depict him in the worst possible light. Now, I'm not offended so much by the latter, but the bias becomes clear. So, a claim. Biden pushed out a Ukrainian prosecutor investigating his son. The Post declares it flatly false. Trump has falsely claimed that Biden in 2015 pressured the Ukrainian government to fire Viktor Shokin, the top Ukrainian prosecutor, because he was investigating Burisma, which had added Hunter to its board in 2014. There are two big problems, they say, with this claim. One, Shokin was not investigating Burisma or Hunter. And two, Shokin's ouster was considered a diplomatic victory. Well, look, we don't have to prove that Hunter Biden operated inappropriately or illegally on the board of Burisma, or that Joe Biden fired Shokin simply because of the risk of investigation of Burisma. It is complicated, and I grant that. But fundamentally, how the fuck did Hunter Biden end up on the board of Burisma Holdings? It's because Joe Biden was in the driver's seat of the U.S. operation that took out Yanukovych and installed Petro Poroshenko. And the idea that you or me or any other stranger would be on the Burisma board is preposterous. So I find that an unpersuasive argument. Then they talk about how in 2015, December, Biden traveled to Kyiv, decried the cancer of corruption in the country, singled out that the office of the general prosecutor desperately needs reform, and by 3 months later, Shokin was gone. So fundamentally, this was meddling in the operations of a sovereign nation by an American vice president whose son benefited from it. And they want us to ignore all that. Just don't pay any attention to that. All right, another allegation from Trump Co. that Hunter Biden made a killing on a China deal. And I'd never heard about this last week. I shared my ignorance with you. But they're saying in 2013, Hunter flew from Japan to China with Daddy on Air Force Two, and there were some introductions that occurred. Then Hunter Biden joined an advisory board which had announced it would try to raise $1.5 billion, but it never did. And so Trump does highly exaggerate this. The company apparently only raised a few $1 million, not the $1.5 billion, and they claim that Hunter has never received any payment from that investment. Then there is the claim that Joe Biden has said that he never talked to his son about Burisma. Quote, "I've never spoken to my son about his overseas business dealings." And the Washington Post tries to rationalize this, okay? I quoted yesterday from a New Yorker article. Hunter quoted his dad as saying, "I hope you know what you're doing in Ukraine," and I said that I do. Now, that is a quote, and the New York Times suggests, the Washington Post fact-checkers here suggest that was the beginning and end of the conversation. They write, that's not much of a discussion. In any case, Biden never said he spoke to his son, as Trump claimed he did. Now, you cannot declare something false based on this kind of hearsay. And this is what the corporate media is repeatedly doing, cleaning up the mess that the Bidens left behind in Ukraine. And even if it is only the perception of conflicts of interest, it will be very useful fodder for whataboutism as this impeachment parade proceeds. Tulsi Gabbard is one of the last remaining holdouts of Democrats in the House on impeachment. As recently as Tuesday, she was against it. But as of today, quote, after looking carefully at the transcript with Ukraine's president, the whistleblower complaint, the Inspector General memo, and Trump's comments, I believe that if we do not proceed with the inquiry, it will set a very dangerous precedent. Future presidents, as well as anyone in positions of power in the government, will conclude that they can abuse their position for personal gain without fear of accountability or consequences. I think you're a little late to the party there, Tulsi. Maxine Waters was one of the people who started the impeachment party. She'd been very vocal, even drawing ugly looks from Nancy Pelosi, staring her down, telling her to shut up. And now she is correctly noting that Mike Pence and Attorney General Bill Barr appear to be co-conspirators, because we know Pence delivered a brushback to Zelensky on the sidelines of a meeting in Poland where Pence subbed for Trump. Maxine Waters, quote, they're all involved. First of all, we've seen that no matter what the president does, they come up with a kind of messaging to defend him. No matter what it is, none of them have had the courage, the patriotism, or the guts to stand up for what is right for the country. So I expect that Pence is part of this conspiracy to try to get Ukraine to do something in a fake investigation and come out with some dirt on Biden. So I'm looking forward to that coming out in the hearings. And that will be done by the Judiciary Committee as they take up the impeachment resolution. Now, as I sat down behind the microphone, I glanced at the Washington Post homepage, and it's been announced that House committees have issued subpoenas to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo for his documents on Ukraine. And if they can draw him into the conspiracy, he may have been involved in sacking the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, for her inconvenient comments and her efforts to try to rein in Rudy Giuliani's freelance operations in Ukraine. So she was recalled in May, months before her term would have run out. She is collateral damage here. Expect to see her testify before an impeachment committee. And then addressing the issues of the Attorney General, Michelle Goldberg has a pretty compelling essay in today's New York Times, citing the whistleblower's complaint and the fact that Bill Barr's Justice Department suppressed it. It was his Office of Legal Counsel that issued the opinion, saying that the complaint didn't have to be turned over to Congress, despite the clear language of the whistleblower statute. And Bill Barr properly should have accused himself because he is named as a possible participant in this shakedown of Ukraine. And Barr did recuse himself from the Jeffrey Epstein case and then unrecused himself when Epstein showed up dead in that jail cell. That's because Epstein had worked for Bill Barr's father. So we'll see just how far this goes and how far the Democrats can push the impeachment train. David Brooks, a moderate Republican who writes for the New York Times and has the perch as a commentator on the PBS NewsHour, in the paper today writes, yes, he's guilty. Impeachment is a mistake. And he has a series of arguments that this will probably achieve nothing and it might give Trump an advantage. I don't get his argument that this is elitist. He's saying if Democrats proceed with the impeachment campaign, it will happen amid candidate debates, primaries, and caucuses. Elections give millions of Americans a voice in selecting the president. And somehow this elitist process, that's bullshit. This is not what the country wants to talk about. That's true, but the polls show that support for impeachment is growing. Over 50% now. Democrats are playing Trump's game because all he wants is food fights in social media, and that this process will produce public cynicism. Yeah, maybe true. I generally respect the senator from Oregon, Ron Wyden, and I've talked to him on a couple of occasions. He published a report from the Senate Finance Committee after an investigation of the NRA's connections to Russia during 2016. What's fascinating is what is not in the report, because it had been alleged, and it's something that I was curious about, thought deserved further investigation. It had been alleged that Russian people or government had funneled money through the NRA that laundered it and spent it on Trump campaign ads. None of that shows up in this report. Instead, they falsely repeat the claims against Maria Butina, make it seem like she was a Russian agent who was tasked with connecting with the NRA, and they basically conclude that some NRA officials misspent money looking for personal profit in Russia. Tragic data released from the Pentagon, a surge in suicides by members of the U.S. military. The numbers have climbed over the past year. Here we get the quote. In 2017, the rate of suicide was 21.9 per 100,000 troops, and it jumped to almost 25 per 100,000 in 2018. If you haven't heard it yet, please listen to the interview with Danny Sherson, which I released yesterday. He talks a lot about his personal PTSD, and how when he was given useless missions, that he phoned it in. Really powerful commentary. The New York Times gives us a little speculation on what's going on in Israel, where Benjamin Netanyahu, based on a one-vote advantage in the Knesset, but not a majority, was given the opportunity by President Reuven Rivlin to form a government. And the Times hints that Benny Gantz, who, by the way, is as bloodthirsty as Netanyahu, he's just a fresh face, and you don't get to choose, right, who the options are. Anyway, Benny Gantz appears to be crazy like a fox, because he actually engineered it, if this is to be believed, that a couple of the Arab lawmakers pulled out from supporting the Blue and White Party, which gave Netanyahu this one-vote advantage. And Gantz believes that by Netanyahu going first in trying to form a government, that he'll fail, and Rivlin will come back to Gantz and give him the opportunity, and that at that point people will fall in line. That seems to be a pretty risky bet. Kudos to Max Blumenthal and the team at the Gray Zone. They exposed Ricardo Hausmann and his daughter, who was featured in the New York Times. They're both partisans who support regime change in Venezuela and back this phony leader, Juan Guaido, that the U.S. just gave $52 million to this week. Well, Anya Parampil published an expose and did an interview with Hausmann, and he has now been forced to resign from it's a bank, here it is in my article, Inter-American Development Bank, because you can't be part of a government and be on a board of an allegedly independent bank at the same time. The drawbridge here at Fortress America is up. Trump administration announcing the lowest cap on refugee admissions for next year in known history, dropping the abysmal 30,000 cap from this year to 18,000 next year. And the asylum plan that I've been railing against has been crammed down the throats of the leaders of Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. The Honduran president's brother is on trial in New York for drug trafficking, and the president himself is implicated, diverting some of that drug money into his campaign accounts. Then you've got the growing corruption in Guatemala, and it leaves these leaders vulnerable to pressure from Washington, and they've signed on to these asylum deals that are just ridiculous. In the past year, El Salvador processed exactly 20 asylum claims. And now they're going to be a hub for people seeking asylum from violent Latin American countries. It's ugly, it's immoral, and it is a death sentence for many of these individuals. Congress, the House, has passed what's called the Safe Banking Act. This is a bold step forward to allow legal pot businesses in 33 states to use banks instead of having to store that money in blankets and under mattresses. This is the legacy of the failure to reschedule marijuana. Obama coulda, shoulda done it, and didn't. Ever heard of the Resnick, Stewart, and Linda? They're billionaires here in California, big boosters of Senator Dianne Feinstein, who has helped them get low-cost water for their huge agricultural enterprises in Southern California, where they grow pistachios and other produce that requires massive amounts of water. They also control Fiji Water, which extracts water from the islands and brings it to sell in the United States. And I mention that because they're not very green, the Resnicks, but they've just donated $750 million for climate research to Caltech. Now, that money's not as tainted as Jeffrey Epstein's, perhaps, but tainted it is. And finally today, yes, I ran a little long. There's just too much news to cover. Words fail me to describe the ridiculousness of the continuing efforts by Trump and his EPA director, Andrew Wheeler, the former clean coal lobbyist, who want to paint San Francisco and California in general as a routine violator of clean air and clean water standards. And we're very proud of the work we've done to clean up the air and to maintain clean water. And the idea that homeless people pooping on the streets of San Francisco is polluting the bay or the ocean is just, I mean, it's not only outrageous, it is cartoonishly inaccurate. But they keep making these claims, and we're not quite sure what they are gunning for. We love your concern. We wish you were sincere. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place, even share it with the Resnicks. You'll find it on YouTube. I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.